It was one of those rare evenings when James Carter finally had a few hours to himself. The life of a royal guard was full of silence and rules, long hours of standing still and never showing emotion no matter what happened. Every day he wore the same red uniform, the tall black hat, and stood outside Buckingham Palace like a statue. Tourists took photos, children waved, and sometimes people tried to make him laugh, but he never moved. Behind that still face, though, there lived a man with feelings, memories, and dreams. He had served with pride for years, always loyal, always humble. That night, for the first time in many weeks, he had planned something special. His younger sister, Claire, had just been promoted at her office. She was proud of her achievement, and James was proud of her. It had been a tough year for both of them. Their parents had passed away a few years ago, and since then, James had taken care of Claire as if she were his own child. They rarely had the chance to celebrate anything, so this time James decided to do something nice. He made a reservation at one of the most popular five-star restaurants in London, a place known for fine dining, shining chandeliers, and famous guests. He wanted Claire to feel special and to forget the hard days they had been through. James wore his best clothes that night. He didn't own expensive suits or polished shoes, but his shirt was clean and pressed, his coat neat, and his shoes freshly shined. Claire wore a soft blue dress, simple but elegant. As they stepped out of the taxi, she smiled, saying it felt strange to see him without his guard uniform. He laughed quietly and said maybe people wouldn't recognize him tonight. He was right, they didn't. When they walked into the restaurant, the smell of rich food and music filled the air. People in fancy clothes sat at shining tables, soft light reflecting from crystal glasses. James looked around with curiosity. He wasn't used to such places. He had stood outside palaces, but never inside one like this. Still, he walked with quiet confidence, holding his sister's hand as they reached the front desk where a man in a black suit stood waiting. The maitre d', tall and serious-looking, gave James a quick glance, his eyes scanning his simple jacket and the small wrinkles in his shirt. Then his gaze moved to Claire's plain dress. Without checking the list, the man said, "Good evening, sir. I'm afraid we're full tonight." His tone was polite but cold. James smiled kindly and said, "I believe I have a reservation. Carter, table for two." The maitre d' looked down at the computer screen, then back at James. "I'm sorry, sir, I don't see your name here," he replied quickly. James leaned forward slightly. "I made the booking 2 days ago," he said softly. It was confirmed over the phone. The man gave a small sigh, pretending to search again. His expression didn't change. "I'm afraid there must be some mistake," he said. "We can't seat you tonight." His voice was firm, leaving no space for argument. Claire frowned. "That can't be right," she said. My brother called and confirmed. "We came all the way for this." The maitre d' smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Madam, we're terribly sorry, but we do have a dress code and a certain atmosphere to maintain. I'm sure you understand." The words were soft, but the meaning was sharp. James understood. It wasn't about reservations or rules, it was about how they looked. His coat wasn't designer. His shoes weren't new, and he didn't wear a watch that cost more than a month's salary. He looked ordinary. That was enough for the man to decide they didn't belong. For a moment, silence filled the space between them. People nearby had begun to notice. A couple at a nearby table whispered. A waiter paused, glancing at the scene. Claire's face turned red, not from anger but from embarrassment. She had worked hard all year, and this dinner was supposed to be a small celebration. Now it was turning into a moment she wished she could forget. James didn't argue. He looked at the maitre d' calmly, his eyes steady but kind. "It's all right," he said quietly. "We'll go somewhere else." "James," Claire whispered, "don't just walk away." "You did nothing wrong," he smiled at her. "It's not worth the noise," he replied. "Let them have their rules." He turned and gently placed his hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the door. The maitre d' nodded, slightly satisfied. As they stepped outside into the cool night air, the city lights seemed to shimmer a little colder. Cars passed, people laughed nearby, but for James everything went silent for a moment. They stood by the street, unsure what to do next. Claire looked at him with frustration. "You should have told him who you are," she said. "If they knew you're a royal guard, they would have treated you like a king." James shook his head slowly. "That's not how respect should work," he said. "If it depends on uniforms or titles, it's not real." She sighed, brushing a tear from her eye. "You're too kind, James," he smiled faintly. "Maybe," he said. But kindness costs less than pride. They began to walk down the sidewalk, searching for another place to eat. Claire's heels clicked softly on the pavement. The evening breeze carried the smell of roasted food from nearby cafes. James looked at the sky and said quietly, "Let's find something simple. The best meals aren't always in the fanciest places." Behind them, the restaurant's glass doors reflected the city lights. Inside, guests were eating and laughing, unaware that a man who stood guard for the royal family had just been turned away like a stranger. James didn't carry anger in his heart, but there was a quiet sadness in his eyes. He thought about his duties, about the people he protected every day without anyone knowing his name. He had stood through long nights, storms, and ceremonies. He had seen royals, diplomats, and tourists. But outside that palace gate, he was just another man, and he accepted that. As they walked farther down the street, Claire slipped her arm into his and smiled gently. "You know," she said, "one day people will see who you really are." James looked at her and replied softly, "It doesn't matter who sees. It matters what you do when no one does." They found a small cafe at the corner, warm and quiet, with golden light glowing through the windows. The waiter smiled and welcomed them in without hesitation. They sat by the window, ordered a simple meal, and began to laugh again. Claire teased him about how serious he looked even when eating. He laughed, and for a moment the night felt light again. But while they ate, something unexpected was already happening behind them. Inside the grand restaurant, a woman who had been dining near the entrance had recognized the man who had been turned away. She had seen his face before, standing still in front of Buckingham Palace. She whispered to her companion that she was sure it was one of the guards. Her friend doubted it, but she knew. She quietly picked up her phone and made a short call. James didn't know it yet, but that one phone call would soon turn the whole evening upside down. For now he sat in the quiet cafe, enjoying a simple meal with his sister, unaware that the very people who had looked down on him would soon be the ones trying to make things right. He looked at his sister across the table and said softly, "See, this place is better. No noise, no pride, just peace." She smiled, nodding. And as they shared dessert, the world around them began to change without them even realizing it. The night air outside felt cold and heavy when James and his sister stepped out of the bright restaurant lights. Cars passed by, their headlights shining across the wet road. The reflection of the restaurant windows flickered behind them, showing a world they were not allowed to enter. Claire walked beside her brother quietly for a few moments, trying to hold back her tears. She had been so excited about that evening, about celebrating something that finally went right in her life. But the way they had been treated made her heart sink. She could not understand how someone could be so polite yet so cruel at the same time. James noticed her silence and slowed his steps. He looked down at her and asked softly, "Are you all right?" She nodded quickly, though her eyes were still wet. "I just don't get it," she said. "Why didn't you say something?" "You could have told them who you are. You serve the royal family. You stand in front of Buckingham Palace every day. If they knew, they would have opened the door for you." James smiled faintly. "That's not the point," he said. "Respect should not come from where you work or who you protect. It should come from how you treat people." Claire frowned and looked away. "Still," she said, "you didn't deserve that." He didn't answer right away. He looked at the city lights ahead, blinking softly through the light fog. London was beautiful at night, but in moments like this, it also felt cold and distant. He thought about all the times he had stood in silence while people passed by him, never knowing his name, never knowing his story. That was the life of a royal guard, silent, invisible, but always present. They walked slowly toward a small bridge that crossed the street. The sound of music came from a nearby cafe, and the smell of coffee filled the air. Claire kept glancing back at the restaurant. "I still feel angry," she said quietly. "It's not fair." James turned to her and said softly, "The world is not always fair. But if we answer unfairness with anger, we lose something good inside us." She sighed deeply, not arguing anymore. She knew her brother well. He had always been calm, even in difficult times. When their parents passed away, he had not cried in front of her. He had just taken her hand and promised that everything would be fine. She was only 12 then, and she believed him because he had never broken a promise. They stopped near a quiet street corner, trying to decide what to do next. Claire leaned against a lamppost, her arms folded. "You know," she said, "I always thought people in fancy places were better, smarter, kinder. But tonight I learned they're not." James looked at her gently. Kindness has nothing to do with money, he said. Sometimes the simplest people show the greatest hearts. She gave a small smile. Like you? He laughed softly. Maybe. Or like the man who will help us find a cab right now. A cab stopped near them and James opened the door for her. Before she stepped in, she turned back toward the restaurant. The maitre d' was still at the entrance, talking to guests, pretending everything was fine. Claire stared for a moment and then whispered, "He should feel ashamed." James said calmly, "Maybe one day he will." They got into the cab and drove off. As the city moved past them, Claire leaned her head on the window and watched the lights blur. "I wish Mom and Dad could see us," she said quietly. "They would have been proud tonight." "They already are," James replied softly. "Not because of where we eat, but because of who we are." For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The cab's engine hummed softly. James thought about how easily people judged by what they saw. To the world, he was just another man in plain clothes tonight. No one knew the long hours he had spent standing at the palace gates or the medals he had received for his discipline, but it didn't matter to him. What mattered was how he carried himself when no one was watching. The cab stopped near a small park. James paid the driver and they stepped out again. The night was quieter here. The wind rustled through the trees and the city noise faded into the distance. They sat down on a wooden bench by a fountain, watching the water glisten under the streetlights. Claire sighed. "Do you ever feel like people don't really see you?" James smiled. "All the time," he said. "But I don't do my job to be seen. I do it because it's right." She looked at him for a long moment. "You always say things that make me think," she said. "It's like you don't get angry even when you should." He looked at the fountain, his reflection dancing in the water. "Anger makes noise," he said. "But calmness makes meaning." Claire leaned against his shoulder. "You sound like Dad," she whispered. He chuckled softly. "Then maybe I'm doing something right." A few minutes passed before they decided to walk again. The night had grown colder and the streets were almost empty. They passed a bakery closing for the night, its warm smell spilling onto the sidewalk. A kind old man sweeping outside smiled at them and said, "Good evening." James smiled back and replied, "Good evening, sir." Claire watched the short exchange and whispered, "That man has more manners than that entire restaurant." James nodded with a small grin. "That's what I meant. True class isn't about where you eat. It's about how you treat people." She smiled and squeezed his hand. "You're right, as always." They finally found another small restaurant nearby. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and smelled of fresh bread and soup. The waitress greeted them with a genuine smile and asked if they wanted a table near the window. They sat down, and for the first time that night, Claire relaxed. As they ate, she watched her brother quietly. He still carried himself with the same posture he did on duty. Straight back, calm hands, eyes observant but kind. She wondered how he stayed that way no matter what happened. When the waitress came to refill their drinks, she said politely, "It's nice to see polite faces around here." "Long day?" James smiled. "A bit longer than usual," he said. "But it's ending well." After she left, Claire leaned closer and whispered, "Do you think they'll ever know what they did?" James shook his head. "Maybe they will. Maybe someone saw it and will remind them, but I don't need them to know. The only thing that matters is how we responded." Still, inside, a small part of him wondered. He didn't want revenge, but he did wish that one day those people would understand what kindness really meant. The evening passed slowly. They laughed again, remembering old times. Claire told him stories about her work, and James told her about some of the tourists he had seen at the palace. When they finished eating, Claire smiled and said, "You know what, this was better. No fancy lights, no rich people pretending to be important. Just us," James nodded. "That's all I wanted." They walked back outside, holding their leftovers in a small paper bag. The street was almost empty now. As they crossed the road, James noticed a black car parked near the corner. A woman in an elegant dress stepped out, speaking on her phone, her eyes glancing toward them. James didn't recognize her, but she recognized him. She had seen that calm face before, outside Buckingham Palace, standing straight in rain and cold. She knew exactly who he was. James didn't notice her gaze. He and Claire continued walking toward the bus stop. The woman's expression changed from curiosity to concern. She whispered into her phone and turned back toward her car. Claire leaned against the bus stop pole and said, "Promise me next time." We'll eat somewhere simple first. James laughed softly. That's a promise. As the bus arrived, Claire stepped on first. James looked back one last time at the shining lights of the restaurant in the distance. He didn't know that, behind those glass doors, people had already begun whispering. The woman who recognized him had connections at Buckingham Palace, and her quiet phone call had already started something unexpected. James sat beside his sister as the bus moved through the sleeping city. Claire closed her eyes, resting her head on his shoulder. He looked out the window, watching the reflection of his own face. There was no anger there, only calm acceptance. He didn't need revenge. He only needed peace. But fate had other plans, and before the next sunrise, the very people who had turned him away would be the ones trying to make things right. Inside the restaurant, the sound of glasses clinking and quiet music filled the air. People talked softly at their tables, enjoying expensive meals, unaware of what had just happened at the entrance. But at one table near the corner sat a woman who couldn't forget the scene she had witnessed a few minutes earlier. Her name was Margaret Allen, and she worked as an aide at Buckingham Palace. She often saw the royal guards during her morning arrivals, always standing still, always calm. When she saw the man at the entrance earlier that night, she recognized him at once. His face, his posture, the way he carried himself, she was certain it was one of the guards. She had seen him many times while passing through the palace gates. She remembered once that he had saluted her boss, the royal liaison, with perfect discipline. Margaret had been about to greet him, but before she could, she saw the maitre d' turn him away. The way it happened had left her uneasy. She had thought at first it might be a small mistake, but when she noticed the looks on the faces of the staff and the embarrassment on his sister's face, she felt something deeper, a quiet anger. How could they treat someone like that? She watched him walk out head high, not saying a single harsh word. His calmness made her feel respect, but also guilt. She couldn't just sit there and pretend she hadn't seen it. She leaned toward her companion and said quietly, "I think that man is a royal guard." Her companion, a senior journalist, raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" "Yes," she said. "I see him every morning at the palace gates. He stands outside in the cold, doesn't move a muscle. He's one of the best." The journalist looked toward the door. If that's true, then the restaurant just made a serious mistake. Margaret took out her phone, hesitated for a moment, and then decided. She knew she couldn't call the palace directly without reason, but she also knew that respect toward the royal service mattered deeply. She made a short call to the royal liaison office, her voice low but clear. "This is Margaret Allen," she said. "I'm at the Crown Terrace restaurant. I just witnessed one of our royal guards, James Carter, I believe, being denied service and spoken to poorly. I thought someone should know." On the other end, there was silence for a moment. Then a calm voice replied, "Thank you, Miss Allen. Please stay where you are for a few minutes." Margaret put down her phone, feeling a strange mix of relief and nervousness. Her companion smiled slightly. "Well," he said, "things are about to get interesting." Meanwhile, James and Claire were still sitting on the late-night bus, unaware of what was unfolding behind them. Claire had fallen asleep with her head resting on her brother's shoulder, the soft hum of the engine keeping her calm. James looked out of the window, lost in thought. The city lights passed by in streaks of gold and silver. He thought about duty, about dignity, and how often the world misunderstood both. He had spent his life protecting something greater than himself. Yet moments like tonight reminded him that most people never looked beyond what they could see. Still, he felt no bitterness. He only wished his sister's night hadn't been ruined. Back at the restaurant, the manager, Mr. Dawson, received a call on his private line. He answered with his usual cheerful tone, but as he listened, his expression changed. The voice on the other end was calm, official, and firm. "This is the Royal Liaison Office," the caller said. "We've received a report that one of His Majesty's Royal Guards, Mr. James Carter, was refused service at your establishment this evening. Can you confirm this?" The manager froze. His heart began to beat faster. I'm not sure," he stammered. "There was a mix-up earlier, perhaps a misunderstanding." "Was he turned away from your restaurant?" The voice repeated. "Yes, but it wasn't intentional," the manager said quickly. "It must have been a mistake." The voice interrupted gently. "Mistake or not, we find it concerning. Mr. Carter is a respected member of the Royal Guard, known for his years of dedicated service. His Majesty's office expects that those who serve the crown are treated with the same respect they give to others. We suggest you correct this immediately." The line went silent after that. The manager stood frozen, his hand still on the phone. The maitre d', who had been standing nearby, noticed the look on his face and asked, "Is something wrong, sir?" The manager turned toward him slowly. "Do you remember the man we turned away earlier?" The maitre d' looked confused for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, the one without a reservation." "What about him?" The manager's face turned pale. "That man is a royal guard from Buckingham Palace." The maitre d's eyes widened. "What?" "Yes," the manager said sharply. "The palace just called me. Someone there saw what happened. They want us to make it right." The maitre d' felt the color drain from his face. He remembered the look in the man's eyes, the calmness, the quiet pride. It made sense now. He wasn't just another guest. The manager didn't waste a second. "Get the car," he ordered. "We're going to find him." Within minutes, the restaurant's car was waiting outside. The maitre d' straightened his jacket nervously while the manager spoke hurriedly on the phone again, trying to find out where James had gone. Margaret, who was still sitting at her table, watched the commotion quietly. She knew the palace didn't take such matters lightly. It wasn't about punishment. It was about principle. Back on the bus, James and Claire had just reached their stop. They got off and began walking home through the quiet street. The city had gone still, and the sound of their footsteps echoed softly. Claire looked more relaxed now. "I feel better," she said. "It's strange, but maybe that happened for a reason. Maybe we were meant to see that the world isn't always kind." James smiled gently. "Sometimes kindness comes later," he said. At that same moment, the restaurant car turned into the main road, heading toward the direction James had taken. Inside, the maitre d' sat nervously beside the driver, his hands shaking slightly. He had replayed the moment over and over in his head, the look on the man's face, the quiet way he had left. He realized he had misjudged someone who carried more honor in his silence than most people did in their wealth. Back at the palace, the royal liaison received another call confirming that the restaurant management was already in action. The officer on duty, an older man named Colonel Whitmore, nodded approvingly. "Good," he said. "Mr. Carter has served with distinction for years. He deserves to be treated with the dignity he's earned." Margaret, who had quietly left the restaurant, smiled to herself as she stepped into her car. She knew James would never expect or ask for an apology, but that made it even more important. Sometimes, she thought, the best people are the ones who never demand recognition. As James and Claire walked down the street toward their small flat, Claire noticed headlights behind them. A car slowed down and stopped near the curb. The door opened and a man in a suit stepped out. James looked at him curiously. It was the maitre d', his face pale and nervous. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice trembling slightly. James hesitated, surprised that the man knew his name. "Yes," he replied slowly. The maitre d' swallowed hard. "Sir, I want to sincerely apologize. There has been a terrible mistake. We didn't realize who you were. Please, the manager would like to invite you and your sister back to the restaurant immediately. Everything will be arranged for you personally." James looked at him silently for a moment, the streetlights shining softly behind him. His sister stared in disbelief. She wanted to speak, but James gently raised his hand. "It's all right," he said calmly. "We appreciate your apology, but there's no need." "Please, sir," the man insisted, his voice shaking. "We've spoken to Buckingham Palace. They told us how much you've done for this country. We are deeply sorry for how we treated you." James gave a small, polite smile. "Thank you," he said quietly. "But respect shouldn't depend on who a person is. It should come naturally." The maitre d' stood frozen, speechless. He had no answer. James nodded to him kindly, then turned to his sister. "Let's go home," he said softly. As they walked away, the car's headlights faded behind them. The maitre d' stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of what had just happened. And somewhere in the quiet streets of London, the man who had been denied a meal walked home with peace in his heart, unaware that his name would soon be known far beyond Buckingham's gates. The night had grown quiet when James and his sister finally reached home. Their small apartment was simple but warm, filled with memories of family pictures and the smell of old books. Claire put her coat on the chair and turned to her brother. She still couldn't believe what had happened. She wanted to say something, but James was already making tea. He didn't look upset, just thoughtful, as if his mind was somewhere else. He handed her a cup, smiled gently, and said, "We should let it go." Claire sighed and sat on the couch. "You always say that," she whispered. "But not everyone can stay calm like you." James sat beside her, holding his cup in both hands. "When you wear that uniform every day, you learn that calmness is stronger than anger," he said. "No matter how people treat you, you must stay steady." Claire looked at him carefully. "You don't have to wear the uniform now," she said. "You're home. You can let it show when something hurts." He smiled faintly. "It doesn't hurt," he said. "It just reminds me that the world still has lessons to learn." Outside, the wind brushed softly against the window. The city was sleeping, but far across town, the restaurant lights still glowed. Inside, the manager stood in the middle of the dining hall, pacing nervously. The maitre d' had returned and explained what had happened. The entire staff listened silently. The manager ran his hand through his hair and said in a low voice, "We can't erase what happened, but we must make it right." One of the waiters whispered, "He didn't even argue with us. He just left." The manager nodded slowly. "That's the kind of man who doesn't need to argue," he said. His silence said everything. He called his assistant and ordered her to prepare a written apology to deliver to the royal liaison's office. Then he told the maitre d' to call James again in the morning and invite him to lunch privately, without the crowd. The maitre d' agreed but still looked uneasy. As the night went on, the restaurant emptied, but the mood was heavy. Even the chef, who rarely cared about outside matters, shook his head and said quietly, "Sometimes the finest places forget what fine really means." The next morning, the sun rose softly over the city. James was already awake before Claire. He had his routine: morning run, tea, then reading the newspaper before heading for duty. His phone buzzed on the table. It was an unknown number. He hesitated for a second before answering. "Mr. Carter?" The voice on the other side asked. "Yes, this is James. This is Richard Dawson, manager of the Crown Terrace restaurant. I wanted to speak to you personally. I owe you and your sister an apology for last night. It was never our intention to cause you embarrassment. I can't express how sorry we are." James was silent for a moment, listening. The manager continued, "We learned who you are, sir, and we feel deeply ashamed. If you would allow it, we would like to invite you and your sister back as our honored guests. Everything will be taken care of personally by me." James smiled softly. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate your call, but you don't need to do anything. The apology is enough." The manager sounded desperate. "Please, sir, we insist. The palace reached out to us and we've already spoken with their office. They were very kind, but we want to make this right from our side." James looked out of the window, thinking. "You don't need to prove anything," he said quietly. "What matters is that you treat the next person who walks in with the same respect you'd give anyone else." The manager didn't know what to say. After a long silence, he said softly, "You're a better man than most, Mr. Carter. I hope we'll have the chance to meet properly one day." James thanked him again and ended the call. Claire, who had been standing near the kitchen door, had heard part of the conversation. "Was that the restaurant?" she asked. He nodded. She crossed her arms. "You should go. Make them see who you really are." James shook his head. "That's not necessary," he said. "They already saw enough," Claire frowned. "But they humiliated you and now they're begging for forgiveness. Don't you want to see how they react when you walk back in?" James looked at her with a calm smile. "That would make it about pride," he said. "And pride doesn't fix anything." Claire didn't answer. She just stared at him for a moment, then sat down beside him and whispered, "Sometimes I think you're too good for this world." He laughed softly. "No, I just try to keep it simple." That afternoon, while James went to his post near Buckingham Palace, the news about what had happened began to spread quietly. A diner who had been at the restaurant that night had posted a short message online. It read, "Saw a humble man turned away from a 5-star restaurant only to learn later he was a royal guard. He left with grace, not anger." The staff are now scrambling to apologize. Within hours, the post was shared hundreds of times. People began to comment, praising the unknown guard's calmness and dignity. Some guessed his name, others just called him the silent gentleman. At the restaurant, calls started coming in. Reporters wanted statements. The manager sighed, realizing there was no hiding from it now. He released a public note that said, "We deeply regret the incident that occurred last evening involving a valued member of the Royal Guard. We have personally apologized and will be donating to a veterans charity in his honor. Respect must never depend on appearance. When Claire saw the post later that evening, she ran into the living room and showed it to her brother. "Look, you're everywhere," she said. James glanced at her phone and smiled. "It doesn't matter," he said quietly. "I didn't do anything special." "But people think you did," she said. "They're talking about how calm you were. Even the palace knows now." He looked thoughtful. "Then maybe it'll remind people that kindness is never wasted," he said softly. The next morning, when James arrived at the palace for duty, his fellow guards looked at him differently. A few smiled, one gave him a small nod. It wasn't much, but he could tell they knew. Even his commander called him into the small office before the shift. "Carter," the commander said, "I heard about last night. I want you to know the palace was informed. They were impressed by how you handled it." James stood at attention, replying simply, "Just doing what felt right, sir." The commander smiled faintly. "Sometimes the hardest thing to do is nothing at all. You did it with dignity." The king's liaison sent a message. "They'll be sending you a letter of appreciation." James nodded, trying not to show emotion. "Thank you, sir." As the day went on, tourists gathered outside as usual, taking photos and waving. James stood as still as ever, but inside he felt lighter. The uniform felt a little different that day, not heavier with duty, but fuller with meaning. Later that evening, when his shift ended, he walked home quietly through the park. The air was cool and the sky glowed pink and gold. Near a bench, an older man was feeding pigeons. As James passed, the man looked up and said, "You're that guard, aren't you?" "The one from the story." James stopped and smiled politely. "I'm a guard, yes, but not sure about the story." The old man chuckled. "Don't be modest, son. I read it this morning. You showed them what respect really means. You made us proud." James nodded slightly. "Thank you, sir. I just did what anyone should." The old man smiled again. "Not everyone would have done it the way you did. You didn't shout or fight. You taught them without words." James thanked him and continued walking, his heart warm from the kindness of a stranger. When he reached home, Claire was waiting with a small surprise, 2 plates of dinner and a candle on the table. "We didn't get to finish our celebration," she said. "So tonight we'll celebrate here." James smiled and sat down. "This is better than any fancy place," he said. She laughed. "And no maitre d' to judge us." He chuckled softly. "Exactly." As they ate, a soft knock came at the door. Claire opened it and found a delivery envelope. Inside was a letter stamped with the royal seal. James opened it carefully. The note inside was written in neat handwriting. It said, "On behalf of His Majesty, thank you for upholding the dignity of the crown not just in uniform but in heart. Your calm strength honors this nation." James folded the letter slowly and placed it on the shelf beside a framed picture of their parents. "They would have liked this," he said softly. Claire smiled. "They already do." The night ended quietly with laughter and simple joy. Outside, the city buzzed as always, but inside their small home there was peace, the kind that no restaurant, no title, and no wealth could ever buy. The morning after the letter arrived, James woke early as he always did. The world outside his window was still gray, the city half asleep. The sound of light rain tapped softly against the glass. He sat at the small kitchen table with his cup of tea, looking at the royal letter resting beside his newspaper. He had read it more than once, not out of pride but disbelief. He never expected that something so small, something so ordinary to him, could reach so many people. He had not tried to make a point or to prove anything. All he did was remain calm when others lost theirs. Yet somehow that calmness had turned into a story that people across the country were talking about. Claire came out of her room, rubbing her eyes. She smiled when she saw him already awake. "You're reading that letter again," she said teasingly. James smiled. "It's still strange," he said. "It feels like it's about someone else." She sat beside him and took a sip from his cup. "It's about you," she said softly. "You did something that reminded people to be kind again. You didn't even have to say much. You just stayed the same." He looked at her with affection. "Maybe it wasn't me," he said. "Maybe people just wanted to remember that dignity still matters." Claire shook her head. "No, it was you. You made people see that humility can be powerful." He smiled, saying nothing more. Later that morning, he put on his uniform and stepped out into the rain. The streets were wet, the air cool and fresh. As he walked toward Buckingham Palace, a few people recognized him. A taxi driver slowed down, honked softly, and gave him a thumbs up. Two school children waved from the sidewalk, their teacher smiling beside them. James gave a small nod, but he didn't stop. He never liked attention. It made him uncomfortable. He was just doing his job, the same as always. When he reached the palace, the guard commander met him near the gate. "Good morning, Carter," the commander said with a faint smile. "I see you've become a bit of a legend overnight." James gave a polite nod. "I didn't mean to, sir," the commander chuckled. "That's exactly why you did. His Majesty read your letter of appreciation last night. He said men like you remind people what true service looks like." James felt warmth in his chest. He didn't know how to respond, so he simply said, "Thank you, sir." The commander patted his shoulder. "Carry on, soldier." James took his post, standing tall and still in front of the palace gate. Tourists gathered as usual, taking photos, whispering, and watching. Some of them pointed, realizing he was the guard from the story. But James didn't move. The world might have been talking about him, but in that moment, he was just doing what he always did, protecting the palace, representing discipline and calm. Hours passed. The rain eased and the sky began to clear. When his shift ended, James walked home again, his boots tapping against the wet pavement. He felt tired but peaceful. As he turned a corner, he saw something that made him stop. Outside the same restaurant that had turned him away a few nights earlier, a small group of people stood with flowers. The restaurant's nameplate had been polished and a notice on the door read, "Closed for a private event." Before he could turn away, a familiar voice called out to him. "Mr. Carter!" It was the restaurant manager, Mr. Dawson. He hurried out, holding an umbrella. "I'm so glad to see you," he said, almost breathless. "Please, would you step inside for a moment?" James shook his head gently. "That's not necessary." "Please, sir," the manager insisted. "We've been waiting for you." "Just for a few minutes." James hesitated, then nodded politely. He followed the manager through the glass doors. The same place that had once felt cold and distant now looked completely different. The lights were softer, the music quiet, and the entire staff stood together near the front. The maitre d', who had once turned him away, stepped forward nervously, holding a small white envelope. "Mr. Carter," the man began, his voice shaking, "I owe you more than an apology. That night I judged you unfairly. I let my eyes decide what my heart should have seen. I was wrong. Your grace that evening taught me something I'll never forget." James listened silently. The man continued, "This letter is for you, signed by our entire staff, and we've made a donation to the Royal Veterans Fund in your name. We wanted to thank you for reminding us that respect is not something to be given to uniforms. It should be given to people." James accepted the envelope with a calm nod. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I don't hold anything against you. Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what they learn from them." The manager looked relieved, and a few staff members smiled softly. They offered him and Claire a table, but James declined politely. "This is enough," he said. "I'm happy to see kindness returned." Before leaving, he looked at the maitre d' and said, "I hope from now on, everyone who walks through that door feels welcome, no matter who they are." The man nodded quickly. "They will, sir. I promise." When James and Claire stepped back outside, the afternoon sun had broken through the clouds. The city sparkled after the rain. Claire smiled as they walked down the street. "You see," she said, "even the ones who hurt you wanted to make things right." James looked ahead, his expression calm. "That's how the world works," he said softly. "One good act reminds others to do the same." As they reached the park, they stopped near a bench. A group of children played nearby, chasing pigeons and laughing. James watched them for a moment, then said quietly, "You know, Claire, the palace might thank me, and the papers might write stories, but the truth is simple. I just didn't want to make someone feel small, even when they made me feel that way." Claire looked at him, her eyes full of admiration. "That's why people respect you," she said. "You don't speak much, but when you do, it stays in people's hearts." He chuckled softly. "Maybe that's because I don't talk enough to ruin it," she laughed. And they both sat on the bench for a while, enjoying the quiet. Over the next few days, the story of the Royal Guard who was denied service continued to spread. Newspapers printed his name with headlines about humility and grace. People on social media shared messages about treating others with kindness. Some said they cried reading about how he handled the situation. James didn't read most of it. He didn't want to live in the spotlight. But one day, a letter arrived from a small school outside London. It was from a group of children who had learned about him in class. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Carter, our teacher told us your story. We learned that being strong doesn't mean shouting. It means staying kind even when others are not. We want to grow up like you." James smiled as he read it. He placed it next to the royal letter on the same shelf. Those two letters, one from the king's office and one from a group of children, meant more to him than any reward. A few days later, while on duty again, he saw a small crowd forming near the palace gates. Among them was a woman holding a camera. It was Margaret Allen, the aide who had made the call that changed everything. When the crowd thinned, she quietly approached and said softly, "Mr. Carter, I'm glad I saw you again. You probably don't remember me, but I was there that night. I made the call to the palace." James blinked in surprise. "You were?" She nodded. "I couldn't let what happened go unnoticed." "You didn't deserve that." He gave a small smile. "Thank you. You did what was right." Margaret smiled warmly. "You're the one who inspired it. Sometimes doing the right thing quietly speaks louder than any protest." He nodded respectfully, and she stepped back as his shift resumed. When the sun began to set that evening, the palace lights came on, glowing softly against the gray sky. James stood at his post, still as stone, but inside he felt lighter than he ever had. He thought about the restaurant, about his sister, about the letters, and about how everything had changed simply because he chose peace over pride. As the tourist passed by, one young boy stopped and looked up at him. The boy whispered to his mother, "That's the nice guard from the story." The mother smiled and said quietly, "Yes, that's him." James didn't move or speak, but his heart felt warm. He realized then that sometimes the greatest changes begin not with power, but with patience. When his shift ended and the palace gates closed for the night, James walked home beneath the soft glow of the streetlights. The world around him was calm again. At his apartment door, Claire was waiting. She held up a newspaper with his picture on the front page and said, "Look, hero of the week." He laughed and shook his head. "I'm no hero," he said. She smiled. "You're mine." He smiled back, stepped inside, and looked once more at the royal letter on the shelf. The candlelight flickered beside it. For a long moment he just stood there quietly, grateful for the lesson, for the peace, and for the reminder that kindness, even when unseen, always finds its way back. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that the world would remember not the guard who spoke loudly, but the one who stayed silent and still made everyone listen.